Hello students, this video is to provide you with an example of how you might structure and put together a presentation with your groups to present on your selected theorist. So you've been assigned a theorist in a group, and this is just going to give you a model for how to do that. Your presentation might include more details and perhaps a few more sources because you're working with 3 or 4 other people in your group. However, you can use this as a model for structure and content, so you can see what kinds of information to include. Okay, so we're going to be talking about John Dewey in this presentation. And John Dewey is one of the most famous theorists in our education system in the United States. He is very well known in our system, and often his work is repeatedly cited in many papers and academic scholarly work. And you'll see why as we keep moving through this presentation. So first off, one of the biggest things you should know about John Dewey is that he was a strong critic of traditional schooling. And the funny thing about that is that when he was writing these things, traditional schooling had actually just barely begun. So he wrote a lot of his things in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And during that time, traditional schooling or compulsory education as we know it was actually fairly new. Now, the idea of school was not new, but compulsory education in which we have a public education system and students are required to attend a public school and it follows a similar structure, that was actually new. And so his work actually is more meaningful when you realize that he was criticizing a system that was actually newly formed, right? So on the left, you see a traditional school model of the time period in which he was living and writing. And on the right is what he was shooting for. And so many of our schools today are just barely getting there, but you can see the differences in that students shouldn't be necessarily following one uniform set of practices, but instead be engaged in a wide range of experiences. So for this purpose of this presentation, each of your group members will select a text to share and talk about. And I've selected Experience in Education. It's one of my favorite books by John Dewey, but I've also included a few links here to some of his other popular books, and these are available for free on Gutenberg. So if you're interested, you can take a look at these, but I'll be talking about experience and education. So a few of the major points from the first several chapters of this book. First off is learning must be analyzed as a personal experience. He was very big on the idea of experiences being the relevant context for looking at learning. He often said in this book that adopting a new philosophy of how education happens is not easy. He talked about that this might seem like a simpler model to follow. However, it's not easy to implement. It requires new kinds of relationships, planning, and curriculum. Education should be seen as taking part in a larger cooperative experience. In other words, all members of the group take part. He was really adamant that education should involve all members of the group equally. And that doesn't mean that every member of the group needs to participate in the exact same way, but everyone should be involved, meaning the teacher becomes more of a facilitator and one who sets up opportunities for learning, and all students find a unique way to engage that fits their abilities and learning style. So he felt that means teachers must know both their subject matter and their students in great depth. So that he was really clear on how teaching is a relationship building process. That's the main focal point of teaching. And so the structure of traditional school restricts freedom is another major point that he made in the first few chapters of this book. He talks about how that structure, and we'll go back and look at it. This structure on the left you see here, in which kids are just kind of following one uniform pathway of procedures over and over again, and the teacher's kind of controlling them. That is very restrictive, he felt. And instead, kids need to have a little more autonomy and a little more say in what happens and a little more choice in how their day goes. And their opinions, their ideas, and their skill sets needs to be valued much more. And if you read his books, you'll see that a lot of what he writes sounds like a modern day critic of schooling, even though he was writing in the very beginning of our school system, which is very interesting. There's a few meaningful quotes here I put on the right that you can see. These are two of my favorites from his text. The first one, It is not the will or desire of any one person which establishes order, but the moving spirit of the whole group. The control is social, but individuals are parts of a community, not outside of it. And this is how he envisioned a modern, effective, progressive classroom should be run. The phrase I really like in that excerpt is the spirit of the whole group. And you can imagine that his attitude about classroom management would not have been focused on rules and procedures, but the spirit of the whole group. What does everybody want out of this time they spend together? And how can we each become an equal and meaningful part of this process? The next quote here is one of my favorites as well. When education is based upon experience and educative experience is seen to be a social process, the situation changes radically. The teacher loses the position of external boss or dictator, but takes on that of the leader of the group activities. He saw the teacher's role as one who merely sets up learning opportunities and facilitates it, not as someone who is in control or in power. And this is actually very innovative and very progressive for this time period, a time period in which people actually felt that schooling needed to exist because we were trying to sort of acculturate people and get everybody to kind of, I guess we could say, become one in a culture. It was a time period where there was a great amount of immigration, a lot of new cultures entering the country. And often people felt that we needed a public school system to acculturate people and socialize them to become culturally American. And so this is actually a very progressive stance that he takes here by saying the teacher is not in charge. They are just merely facilitating group activities. That instead of trying to acculturate people, that implies that you are allowing them to be themselves and bring themselves into it. Now, funds of knowledge was not around at this time, I believe John Dewey would be a big fan of that theory. All right, so here's a quick biography of John Dewey. He was an American philosopher who used psychological theories to research the field of education. He spent most of his professional career as a professor and researcher. He was married to Alice Chipman, who was a school principal, and this greatly influenced his work. So prior to being married to her, he was heavily involved with research and writing on philosophy. And he would even delve into things like religion or ethics and things like that. And once he married an educator, he started to apply all that philosophical work into the school system and looking at how schools impact society as a whole. Eventually, most of his research shifted to focus on schooling. And you'll see that in the list of his books and his articles. In the beginning, very focused on philosophy as a whole and societal issues. And then he shifts over to classroom issues. John Dewey lived and worked during the time of American history in which compulsory education was new, and educators regularly debated what the school system should do for families and society as a whole. I mentioned this already, but compulsory education did not actually become a legal issue until the 1930s, right, when he was writing these things. So you can imagine that these were really hot topics at the time. Some of his major accomplishments and contributions to the field of education. First off, he became a professor in the beginning of his career at the University of Chicago and later moved on to Columbia University. That's where he spent most of his career. He had many academic accomplishments after his PhD, and he wrote about a dozen books and 30 other publications in a range of different topics and fields, most of them having to do with education and learning. His philosophy in the beginning was known as Pragmatism, although he preferred the term cultural naturalism. And so this philosophy critiques what is truth and ways of knowing. He felt that what works is truth, as opposed to trying to debate something through logic. If it works for human beings and they find it useful, then it must be true. So he was famous for combining philosophy with current social issues, particularly education. He emphasized the importance of democracy and how education influences, upholds, and promotes democracy in society. This was a really important aspect of his work. And you can see in a lot of his writings that most of what he believed had to do with how we can actually uphold an effective democracy in the United States. It was very much an American philosophy that he was writing. It was catered to our culture and our our times and what we needed in that time. And so he felt that we need people who are innovative thinkers and individuals. We need that in the United States, as opposed to kind of the alternate view, which would be kind of homogenizing our culture. And so he was, I wouldn't say radical, but he was definitely on the progressive side of his for his time for philosophers. So his learning theories and how this is impacted. Now, as you're doing your group work, you're going to look at some learning theories and try to find a connection between your theorist and which learning theory might match some of their work. This is very easy for John Dewey because he is actually one of the fathers of social learning theory and progressive education. In fact, if you spend some time and Google progressive education, one of the names that's going to come up over and over is John Dewey. So that fits into social constructivism or social learning theory. And Dewey did a lot of work in psychology. So I think his work would fit nicely with that theory, and he used it a lot in his writings. And so if you look up social learning theory and read a little bit about it, you're going to find that learning builds on prior experiences and social interactions. Teachers are facilitators instead of being in charge. They are just there to organize the group and pave a way for the group to learn. You set up opportunities to learn. In other words, you are not the sage on the stage, right? You are instead in the background just supporting students. And you can actually see that here in this picture. This image is a photograph taken of one of John Dewey's research projects. So in his research, he often set up classrooms and brought in children and teachers and had them facilitated in a particular way and studied them. And so this is a picture of it. And the great thing about this teacher is the first thing you don't notice is, where is the teacher? She is in there, but it's hard to spot her, right? Because all the kids are spread out doing different things, and they're engaged in a wide range of different kinds of learning activities that suit them. And you can actually, if you look carefully, you'll see her in this back corner supporting one student here with this book, and she's probably helping him with one thing, but there are a lot of kids doing a range of different things in this classroom. And so he felt that actually a school should reflect what the larger society looks like. Everybody has different jobs, and that's okay. We don't have to be in one uniform set of standards or processes. And so I think if Dewey were alive today, he would look at our standardized system in schooling and really criticize it quite a bit. He believed that learning had to do with the relationships of students and teachers. And so progressive education, which is one of the major theories he pushed that became very common. Majority of educators nowadays, if they are to take some sort of assessment or to categorize themselves in one philosophy, majority of them will say they are progressivist educators. And that is largely to do with John Dewey's work. And that promotes hands-on learning, learning by doing, and student-centered kind of classrooms. So the last part of your presentation on your theorist should reflect back on what that person's work meant for education, what those major accomplishments mean, and what they look like in the classroom. And the context with which you're going to do that is to relate it back to our case studies. Our first day in class, we watched 2 interview videos with our case study participants, Joe and Josh. And so you can actually go back to week 1 and watch those videos again if you need to as a group. And I have made a connection here for each of them. And so you can go back and watch those. I'm not going to summarize the whole video for you, but I've made a connection to John Dewey's work in each person. So the first example with Joe, I put down that progressive education is more student-centered and therefore would have promoted the building of relationships. This case study subject mentioned that he had only one meaningful relationship with a teacher in his entire high school experience. Stronger student-teacher relationships are especially important for bilingual and immigrant students. So if you remember, in that case study, he was a bilingual immigrant student. So he was still learning English when he started school here. And he mentioned in that interview that he only really had one really strong relationship with a teacher that he felt really believed in him. And part of what John Dewey talks a lot about is the importance of relationships between teacher and student. And I believe that if more teachers took on John Dewey's approach and adopted his theories, that would have made this person's school experience much better. Let's talk about the next case study, Josh. Remember, if you remember right, he was the gifted student that grew up here in LA and felt pretty much unmotivated throughout school. He completed school and was successful, and yet never felt like it meant much to him. There wasn't a lot of purpose for him. So I put down here that progressive education allows for student input and a natural environment that more accurately reflects real life than traditional schooling. This case study subject would have benefited from curriculum and lessons focused on real world problems that help students identify career opportunities. This kind of teaching would have likely been more motivating for a student like this who felt bored. If you remember in that interview, he mentioned quite a bit that he felt like he didn't see a purpose in school. And many times our gifted students become bored and they start giving up on school when they don't see a broader connection to their life or real life issues. And so progressivism, or John Dewey's theories of progressivism and pragmatism, would have been an appropriate solution to that problem for him. So your job as a group is to review those case studies and decide what element of that theorist's work would relate back to one or both of these two case studies. You don't have to talk about both, but at least pick one of the two, and decide how this theorist and their work might relate back to the experience that that person had. Would their experience have been better if teachers had adopted some of these theories in this work by this theorist that you are presenting on? And if so, outline that for us. If you think it's not appropriate, consider the other case study. And if you still don't, maybe you decide that that theory would not work for this person, and that's okay. Explain that as well if that's what you think. So that's the end of this, and I hope that you can use this as an example to prepare your presentation and organize yourself in your groups. Please reach out to me if you need further help.